success. Turn on the microphone. We'll start again. The Academic Success Center at BYU says this about test-taking strategies. The answer which comes first to mind is often correct. Nervously reviewing questions and changing answers can do more harm than good. And while that might be good advice for taking multiple choice tests, the tests that life throw at us are not so simple. And hopefully our first reactions will be the correct one, but sometimes it pays to review the questions and to change our response. The goal is to learn so that more and more our first reaction will be a godly reaction, the correct response. For example, one of life's greatest tests is the test of good news. How do you react when you are blessed with good news? Today we have what we're calling First Fruit Sunday. This church has been blessed by hundreds of you making commitments to Our Hope campaign to pay our mortgage and rent. We have a ways to go, and if you've not yet made a commitment, let me invite you to do so. There's these little trifold pamphlets still available, and if you'd make your commitment today and just drop it in the offering plate, that would be great. But whether you filled out a commitment card or not, this is the day to make our first gifts, to present our first fruits to the building fund through our Hope campaign. We've been blessed, and I thank you in advance for your first fruits gift. But we didn't invent first fruits here at this church. We took the idea from what God told the Israelites as they prepared to enter the Promised Land. If you recall, God had rescued the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, but they had wandered in the desert for 40 years. For 40 years, they survived by eating a sticky, flaky thing that they gathered up from the ground called manna. Every morning, every noon, every evening, they ate manna. But now, after 40 years, they are on the verge of settling down and planting crops and enjoying the fruits of the land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Finally, after 40 years, they would have an abundant harvest and rich foods. So what would you do? What would your first reaction be to this good news of an abundant harvest? Would you pig out, gorge yourself? Would you pat yourself on the back for being such a good farmer? Would you hoard your crops, stuffing them into barns and worrying about the bad times to come? What would you do? Well, that's very interesting. What would you do if you were blessed with an abundant harvest for the very first time in 40 years? Well, God says in Deuteronomy 26 that the correct response is to give. To take the very first fruits, the ones that you have waited for so long, and to put them in a basket, and to place them before the Lord, and to bow down and worship and rejoice in all the good things that the Lord has given you. The first response to the blessings of God should be to give and worship and rejoice. But that's not how everyone responds to God's blessing, is it? I want to shift gears and I want to jump ahead in time up to the time of the early church in Acts chapter 12 for our story this morning. In this story, King Herod has already had James, John's brother, executed, and now Peter is the next Christian in line to be killed. And we pick up the story at the 5th verse of chapter 12. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. The night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and sentries stood guard at the entrance. Suddenly, an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. "Quick, get up," he said, and the chains fell off Peter's wrists. Then the angel said to him, Put on your clothes and sandals, and Peter did so. Wrap your cloak around you and follow me, the angel told him. Peter followed him out of the prison, but he had no idea that what the angel was doing was really happening. He thought he was just seeing a vision. They passed the first and the second guards and came to the iron gate leading to the city. It opened for them by itself, and they went through it. When they'd walked the length of one street, suddenly the angel left him. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I know without a doubt that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were anticipating." When this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. Peter knocked at the outer entrance, and a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer the door. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed she ran back without opening it and exclaimed, "Peter is at the door!" "You're out of your mind," they told her. When she kept insisting that it was so, they said, "It must be his angel." But Peter kept on knocking. And when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Peter motioned with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of prison. "Tell James and the brothers about this," he said, and then he left for another place. This is an example of a first response that maybe isn't the best. Rhoda gets so excited that God has freed Peter from prison that she leaves him standing on the doorstep. Worse yet, when these church people hear about her fantastic news of what God has done for Peter, they don't believe her. "You're out of your mind. It must be his angel. It must be a ghost." They won't accept the good news that is right at their doorsteps. And so Peter is left out in the cold, knocking and knocking. Finally, of course, they do let him in. But Peter has drawn so much attention to himself out there pounding on the door that he must move on and find another place to stay. Not every first reaction is the right one. Refusing to believe what God has done, shutting the door to God's miracles, is probably not the response that we should have. If we have a response like that, we probably should take a second look. So what about you? What is your first reaction to the test of good news? Is your first reaction to give and worship and rejoice in what God has done for you? Or is it to do nothing, leaving the good news on the doorstep? Or even refusing to believe that God has done a great work in your life? How do you react to good news? And for that matter, how do you react to bad news? Good news is one test, but bad news is another. Are you able to worship and acknowledge God even when the news is bad? Or do you have a different reaction? In our story in Acts 12, it's Herod who gets the bad news. He had so looked forward to sticking it to the Christians and watching Peter die. And he would have been ever so popular with those who hated the church. His approval rating would have skyrocketed. But now Peter is missing, and Herod is cheesed. Verse 18. In the morning there was no small commotion among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. After Herod had a thorough search made for him and did not find him, he cross-examined the guards and ordered that they be executed. Herod's first reaction to bad news is that age-old favorite: take it out on somebody else. Well, if I can't execute that Christian, I'm going to execute somebody today. I'm mad and somebody's going to suffer for it. Now, we've all known people like Herod, haven't we? Maybe you worked for Herod. Anytime things didn't go well, you knew somebody at work was going to get it. Or maybe you lived next to Herod. And that old grouch of a neighbor was always taking out his frustrations and making everyone else in the neighborhood suffer.